In the summer of 2014, detectives in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, were frustrated. They were nearly 2 weeks into a mysterious case, and while they had plenty of leads, so far, the pieces of the investigation just weren't fitting together. It was clear that there was something they were missing. As luck would have it, authorities were about to receive a call from a fellow investigator in Pittsburgh, one who said that she had come across a bit of video footage that they might want to take a look at. When detectives reviewed the surveillance video, they not only knew that they had found their missing piece, they realized why nothing had been making sense up until that point. It turned out that they had been following the right trail. It's just that they had been looking in the wrong direction. In July of 2014, 59-year-old John Jack Parks Jr. was eagerly anticipating the next chapter of his life. He had recently retired from his job, had big plans for the future, and in just under 6 weeks' time, was going to be marrying the love of his life, 48-year-old Carol LaPaya. The wedding in particular had been a long time coming. You see, Jack and Carol had actually been together for nearly 25 years. They had met one night at a bar in 1989 and had immediately been drawn to one another. They had been the most important people in each other's lives ever since. Despite getting engaged 5 years later and moving in together, Jack and Carol hadn't decided to get married until recently. It wasn't that they weren't sure that they wanted to spend the rest of their lives with one another. The love in the relationship never wavered. Instead, the timing just never seemed to click. At first, Carol wanted to get married and Jack didn't. And later on, Jack wanted to get married and Carol had changed her mind. Finally, however, the stars had seemed to align. Jack and Carol announced a date, August 31st, 2014. Family and friends were excited and extremely happy for the couple, but they knew that this final step was really more of a formality than anything. As far as they were concerned, Jack and Carol had been husband and wife in all but name for more than 2 decades. In that time, the pair had built an extremely happy life for themselves. They had a nice home in Kennedy Township, Pennsylvania, where they were close to lots of other family members. This was especially important to Jack, for whom family was the most important thing in the world. Though he and Carol never had kids of their own, you wouldn't have known it from looking inside their house. Pictures of their nearly a dozen nieces and nephews were all over the place, including a special area of the dining room where a dedicated portrait of each of them was hung on the wall. Jack and Carol had been such a presence in some of the kids' lives growing up that they had arguably helped to raise them. In an interview we came across, his niece, Melanie Lynn, described Jack as the cool uncle. She stated that she and her brother, Bradley Johnson, in particular, spent a lot of time over at Jack and Carol's house. She fondly remembered the countless sleepovers growing up where they would stay up late watching movies, and how Jack was always there with some Jiffy Pop popcorn to make over the stove. Indeed, the pictures that adorned Jack and Carol's walls were a testament to just how many milestones they had been around for. The countless birthday parties, Melanie and Bradley's graduations, and the photo they had taken together right before Carol's nephew, Michael LaPaya, had gone on his first deployment after joining the military. In every case, Jack couldn't have been more proud. While planning a wedding can certainly be stressful, with just over a month to go, the mood was one of excitement rather than anxiety for the bride and groom-to-be. Everything was on track. The couple had sent out their invitations long ago, the party favors were all done up, they had picked out their rings, and Carol had her dress. It seemed like the only thing left to do now was count down the days. Heartbreakingly, though, Carol and Jack would never get the chance to walk down the aisle. In a tragic twist of fate, instead of throwing a wedding, in just a few days' time, one of them would be organizing a funeral. Just before 11 a.m. on July 21st, 2014, Carol LaPaya received a call during the middle of her workday. It was from a real estate agent, one who she and Jack had recently hired to help with selling Jack's mother's house. His mother, Doris, had passed away earlier that year, and the responsibility of figuring out what to do with the property had been assigned to him. The real estate agent told Carol that she had found a potentially interested buyer and wanted to know if she and Jack were available later that afternoon to meet them at the house. She said she was sorry to bother Carol at work, but she had tried calling Jack a couple of times and couldn't get a hold of him. Immediately after ending her conversation with the real estate agent, Carol tried phoning Jack herself. She called his cell phone and their house, but both calls went to voicemail. Right off the bat, Carol felt a little uneasy. As far as she knew, Jack was just supposed to be puttering around at home, so he should have been able to pick up the phone. At the very least, he should have called her back, she thought. After all, Jack knew she could be a bit of a worrier. Carol's concern steadily grew when she called back an hour later and there was also no answer. The same thing happened at 1 o'clock, then again at 2. By the time Carol left work at 2:30, she was feeling anxious enough that she drove straight home, arriving about 20 minutes later. When she first pulled into the driveway, Carol breathed a momentary sigh of relief. The garage door was open and she could see that Jack's favorite car, his 1977 Lincoln Continental Mark V, was still there. The vehicle was his prized possession, and he only would have left the garage door open if he was doing some work on it in there. Any sense of calm that Carol had felt quickly evaporated, though, when she got out of her own car and started heading towards the house. That's when she noticed that the gate to their front deck had been left open. This was something that Jack never would have done. They had dogs and were careful to close the gate firmly behind them so that they wouldn't get loose. When Carol got to the front door, she spotted the next sign that something wasn't right. Instead of just the handle to the door being locked, the door was secured with the deadbolt, something they rarely, if ever, used. Taking a deep breath, Carol pulled out her keys and unlocked it. What was waiting for her on the other side of that door was nothing short of horrifying.
Okay, now an address for emergency.
I just come home from work. He's been on the ground. Please, somebody.
Okay, what city township are you in, ma'am?
I'm in Kennedy Township. There's a big puddle of blood, and he's...
Where's the blood coming from, do you know?
I can't see.
Do you think that we would be able to help him if I walked you through it? Do you want to try CPR on him?
Upon opening the door to her house, Carol was greeted by an awful scene. Her heart dropped into her stomach as her brain struggled to catch up with what she was seeing. Poking out from behind the coffee table in the living room, just a few feet in front of her, were Jack's feet. She ran over to find him face down on the floor, a pool of blood around his head. While on the phone with 911, Carol started to perform CPR. She couldn't get Jack's mouth open after turning him over, but refused to give up anyway, pleading with him the entire time to wake up. When emergency responders arrived at the scene minutes later, sadly, they could quickly tell that nothing could be done. They tried to explain this to Carol, but she wouldn't stop trying, unable to accept that Jack was gone. In the end, police had to physically pull her away from his body. Heartbreakingly, the only words she could muster the entire time were, "We were going to get married." As tragic as all of this already was, unfortunately, it was about to get much worse. You see, when Carol found Jack's body, initially she thought that he had fallen and hit his head. That was about to change when investigators took a closer look at his injuries. When they did, they discovered a small hole behind his right ear that was unmistakably the entry wound left behind by a bullet. The only thing near Jack's body at the time he was found was a television remote, so this gunshot could not have been self-inflicted. Jack Parks had been the victim of a brutal murder. After the first officers at the scene realized that they were dealing with a murder, detectives with the Allegheny County Police Homicide Unit were called in to take over the investigation. A perimeter was also set up, as neighbors, family members, and others started to gather outside. At first, no one knew what was going on. However, when they saw Carol crying hysterically outside with her hands and face covered in dry blood, they knew it couldn't be good. Upon heading inside and having a look around the rest of the house, detectives quickly uncovered their first clue as to what might have happened. The place showed obvious signs of having been ransacked, with the upstairs in particular being left in a serious state of disarray. Papers and items had been thrown everywhere, drawers and cabinets were left wide open, and clothing was scattered everywhere on the floor. Among the items that stood out to investigators the most was a decently sized jewelry box which was found on the carpet of the master bedroom. It was also open and looked like it had been almost entirely cleaned out. This would soon be confirmed when Carol told authorities that a large number of items were missing from this box. This included several pieces of gold jewelry belonging to her and Jack, as well as pieces from Jack's coin collection. Based on this, detectives theorized that robbery very likely was a motive. It appeared that whoever had done this was looking for valuables and had tossed the house in search of whatever they could find. That being said, police weren't sure if it was the only motive. You see, by this time, a closer examination of Jack's body and the way that he had been killed had revealed its own troubling clues. For starters, the location of the bullet wound to the 59-year-old's head, as well as the place and direction he had fallen when he was found, suggested that he had been walking away from his killer when he was shot. Since there were no signs of forced entry at the house, it appeared that whoever the shooter was, Jack had willingly let them inside. During Jack's autopsy, the fatal bullet was recovered from his head. It was a .380 caliber round that had likely been fired from a small handgun. A check of the rest of Jack's body revealed no defensive wounds on his hands or anywhere else. Disturbingly, all of this seemed to indicate that Jack had been ambushed, probably not long after he had let the killer into the house. In short, the person who had done this was almost certainly someone he knew and thought he could trust. With this in mind, detectives turned their attention to those closest to Jack. They began with the 59-year-old's bride-to-be, Carol LaPaya. After being taken down to the police station, Carol was asked about everything that had happened in the lead-up to the murder. What had she been doing that day? When did she first realize that something might be wrong? And perhaps most importantly, was there anyone that she could think of that might want to hurt Jack? Carol explained that, like every weekday, she had left the house pretty early that morning. She started work at 6 a.m., so she estimated she had gotten in her car sometime just after 5:30. She stated that when she headed out, everything seemed fine. Jack was still asleep in bed, and she hadn't noticed anything strange either inside or around the property when she drove off. Carol said that her morning had been normal until she got that call from the real estate agent. That's when she started phoning Jack repeatedly and couldn't get an answer on his cell phone or at the house. Though Carol seemed genuinely devastated and heartbroken about Jack's murder, because of her relationship with him and the fact that she was the one who found his body, she was an obvious person of interest in the minds of detectives, especially when they found out about her and Jack's upcoming wedding. They wondered, was it possible someone had gotten cold feet and that this had led to some kind of altercation? They asked Carol, were there any problems in her and Jack's relationship? They also wanted to know, did either of them own any weapons? Carol said that she never would have done anything to hurt Jack. He was the love of her life. Yes, they had their disagreements here and there, but these were the normal kind of fights that any couple had, and never anything physical or abusive. As for cold feet, Carol said no way. They'd had 25 years to think about whether or not they wanted to get married. Neither of them was backing out now. They couldn't have been more excited. Finally, she said that neither she nor Jack owned any firearms. After speaking with some more of Jack's friends and family, detectives were convinced that Carol was telling the truth. They all agreed with her characterization of their relationship, saying that she and Jack were very much in love and were happy. Calls to Carol's colleagues and boss confirmed her alibi. She had been at work right up until 2:30 that afternoon, just like she told police. With Carol now ruled out as a suspect, investigators hoped that she might be able to provide them with some idea of who else they might want to look into. Did Jack have any enemies? Were there any conflicts within the family that she knew about? Carol couldn't think of anything. Unfortunately, this was pretty much the same story with everyone else who police spoke to. As far as they knew, everyone loved Jack. He was a goofy, charming, fun-loving guy. Definitely not the type that anyone would have expected to die in such an awful way. Needless to say, the The timing of the whole thing was an added blow to Carol and the rest of Jack's loved ones. Just days earlier, they were excited to attend his wedding. Now, they were getting ready to bury him. In an interview, Carol later recalled how she was still in shock when the funeral took place 5 days later. As the service was being delivered, she couldn't process any of the words that were being said. All that she remembered was hearing Jack's name over and over again. In the meantime, authorities were pursuing as many leads as possible to try and get the case off the ground. They still believed that robbery was the most likely motive, but they were now expanding their pool of possible suspects to people who might not have been as close to Jack as initially thought. One of these suspects was a man who had been caught for another burglary in the area. While this crime was not nearly as violent, police wondered if the two crimes might be linked after it was found that rare coins had been stolen in this case as well. This theory was ruled out, however, when it was discovered that the man had specifically targeted the home of an ex-employer and had no link to Jack or Carol. A canvassing effort in the couple's neighborhood led to a second theory. While speaking with neighbors, several people told police that they should talk to the people working at the Silver Star Meats plant. The combined factory and deli was just across the street from Jack and Carol's house, and neighbors said that they had a reputation for hiring some questionable characters. When detectives asked Carol about this, she said that Jack was friendly with some of the employees at the company and would often chat with them when he was out in their front yard. In fact, she had actually gotten mad at Jack in the past because he would let some of the workers into the house to use the phone or the bathroom. Investigators also discovered that the time of the morning break at the factory coincided with the window when Jack had started missing calls from his real estate agent. They wondered, had someone who was friendly with Jack there managed to talk their way inside and then committed a crime of opportunity? Detectives ended up interviewing nearly 40 people at the meat company. Frustratingly, this turned out to be a massive waste of time, as nothing noteworthy was uncovered. Fortunately, this streak of bad luck was about to change. It happened when authorities received a phone call out of the blue that would finally get the case back on track. 3 days into the investigation into Jack Parks' murder, detectives with the Allegheny County Police got a call from a man named Theodore Hazlitt. Hazlitt explained that he was a pawn shop owner in the nearby Pittsburgh borough of Sharpsburg, and that he wanted to speak with authorities about a recent interaction he'd had with a potential customer that had left him feeling uncomfortable. Hazlitt stated that at around 1 p.m. on July 21st, so right in the general window of time in which Jack's murder had taken place, a young couple had come into his shop, called Cash for Collectibles. The man and woman had been carrying a large pouch. Inside were more than a dozen pieces of what was almost exclusively gold jewelry, which the man indicated he was looking to sell. As soon as Hazlitt took a closer look at the gold, though, he said that he got an uneasy feeling. A number of the items had what appeared to be tool marks from a hammer and a pair of pliers. Hazlitt had seen this before, and it was almost never a good sign. Usually it meant that someone was trying to make the jewelry less identifiable, likely because it was stolen. Thinking quickly, Hazlitt told the man that he didn't have enough cash on hand to buy the gold that day, but that if he was interested, he would take pictures of the items so that he could show his broker. That way he could get the money in time for early the next day. The man said that would be fine and had allowed Hazlitt to take the photos. After telling authorities all of this, Hazlitt handed the photos over to them. As soon as investigators saw them, they knew that this was a promising lead. Several of the pieces of gold jewelry were a match to distinctive pieces that Carol had told them was missing from her and Jack's house, including some dice earrings, a football charm, and another charm shaped like a clover leaf. When Carol saw the actual photos of the items, she also confirmed that she recognized all of them as belonging to either her or Jack. Unfortunately, the man and woman who tried to sell the gold never returned to Hazlitt's shop after the initial visit, so he didn't have the actual items or the couple's names. However, Hazlitt said that he was pretty sure that the man had been in his shop before. As a result, police put together a photo array of known thieves in the area that fit the description he provided. It seemed like they got another lucky break when Hazlitt picked one man out of the lineup, a 29-year-old named Brian Gibbons. Now, Brian didn't have any kind of a violent criminal history, but he had been in trouble multiple times in the past for theft, burglary, and receiving stolen property. He also lived in Shaler Township, which is right next to Sharpsburg. With this, detectives were able to obtain a search warrant for Brian's house, which they quickly executed. The search initially appeared promising when police found a cache of items, including purses and watches, that were hidden away and looked like they had been stolen. However, they were unable to locate any of the jewelry that had been photographed at the pawn shop, and when they asked Carol about the stuff that they did find, she said none of it belonged to her and Jack. Things continued to go sideways when police showed Carol a picture of Brian Gibbons, and she said that she'd never seen him before in her life. Detectives wondered if maybe Jack had been hiding financial problems, or else was involved in some sort of activity that might make sense of this whole development. But to their frustration, no matter how hard they looked, they just couldn't find any connection between Jack and Brian. The 29-year-old was still taken into custody because of the suspected stolen property found in his house, and police weren't ready to drop the lead entirely. But in the meantime, they decided that they needed to come at the murder case from a different angle. That's when they discovered some information that turned them towards another potential suspect, specifically to one of Jack's nephews, 24-year-old Bradley Johnson. As previously mentioned, Bradley and his sister Melanie were among the nieces and nephews that Jack was closest with. For this reason, no one had suspected Bradley of being involved initially, although that changed after investigators became aware of a couple new crucial details. For starters, Bradley owned a .380 caliber gun. He also lived across the street from Jack and Carol and admitted going to their house on the morning of the murder. When Bradley was brought in for an interview, he explained that he had walked over from his parents' house at around 10:30 a.m. that day and had stayed for about 45 minutes. The reason was straightforward. He wanted to speak to his uncle about the possibility of him and his fiancée moving into Jack's mother's house. Bradley said that after going over, he had proposed this idea, asking if they could work out some kind of a loan or rent-to-own situation. Jack said he had to think about it and wanted to discuss the idea with Carol first. Bradley said that this had irked him, as the whole reason he went over at the time he did was because he knew Carol would be at work. He thought that the conversation about what happened to his grandmother's house should stay within this side of the family, and in his words, didn't want Carol putting her 2 cents in. Jack had stayed firm though, and had insisted that he wouldn't make any kind of a decision without speaking to Carol. This last bit in particular caught the attention of detectives. They asked Bradley, had his uncle's refusal led to an argument? The 24-year-old said no. He had left a little annoyed, sure, but it wasn't that big of a deal. Despite Bradley's denial, investigators weren't so sure, especially since he was now the last confirmed person to have seen Jack alive before the crime, and he owned a .380 caliber gun. As the 24-year-old's weapon was sent off for testing, authorities took a look back at Brian Gibbons to see if there was any possible connection between him and Bradley. Unfortunately, just like before, they came up short. In fact, not a single one of Jack's friends or family members knew who Brian was. Detectives were even more stumped when ballistics testing came back for Bradley's gun. It did not appear to be a match to the weapon that had killed Jack Parks. Neither was any other firearm that Bradley owned. At this point, investigators weren't sure what to do. They had a bunch of promising-looking leads, but none of them seemed to be fitting properly into the case. Well, as it happened, there was a very good reason for this. You see, one of the key pieces of the puzzle that they had uncovered so far was actually wrong. In order to figure that out, though, it would take one last break. One that would finally reveal the identity of Jack Parks' killer. On August 4th, 2014, so exactly 2 weeks into the investigation into Jack Parks' murder, Allegheny County detectives received a call from a fellow investigator with the Pittsburgh Police Department. This investigator worked with a special unit within the Pittsburgh Police, one that specialized in analyzing pawnshop records. Allegheny County detectives had initially contacted this investigator after learning that Jack's killer might be trying to pawn his stolen gold. Even though the suspect had never returned to Theodore Hazlitt's shop, they reasoned that he might have tried to get rid of it somewhere else. It turned out that they had been right. The investigator said that she was pretty sure that she had found something. Specifically, the investigator explained that she had come across a transaction for jewelry that looked incredibly similar to the items that had been stolen from Jack and Carol's house. The items had been sold to a local business called Pittsburgh Gold Pawn Shop. Detectives reached out to the store's owner, Becky Halverson, who invited them in to take a look. Upon arriving, it was clear that they had found the stolen jewelry. When asked, Becky said she definitely remembered the man who had sold it to her. He was pretty young and had been waiting for her outside the shop before she even opened on the morning of July 22nd. Like Theodore Hazlitt, Becky also noticed that the jewelry appeared to be beaten up, although she didn't assume that meant that it had been stolen. After weighing everything, she had offered the guy a little over $1,000, and he had happily accepted. As required by law, Becky had taken down the man's information and had uploaded a photo of the gold she bought to a central database where it had been seen by the Pittsburgh investigator. While the ID that the man had provided during the transaction alone was a huge break for detectives, Becky was able to give them something else that was just as valuable: surveillance video taken from the store at the time. Together, these confirmed who had sold the stolen gold. It wasn't Brian, and it wasn't Bradley. However, it was a person that police recognized. It was Carol's nephew, 23-year-old Michael LaPaia. Now, prior to this, Michael was someone who detectives had interviewed, but he had been able to provide an alibi, one that had been backed up by his girlfriend, Melanie Gigliotti. Just a heads up in case you're confused, this is a different Melanie, not the one we mentioned earlier who was related to Jack. Anyway, during his initial interview, Michael claimed that he was with his girlfriend all day on July 21st. He said that he and Melanie spent a good chunk of the day at home, but that at one point they went out shopping and he also had a medical appointment. When authorities looked into this initially, it had appeared to add up. After discovering the footage of him at the pawn shop, though, they started to look closer and found holes in his timeline. Detectives were also able to get a hold of Michael's phone records. When they did, they discovered that his cell phone had pinged a tower right near Jack and Carol's house at 11:45 a.m. that day. Previously, Michael had denied ever being close to the property around the time of the murder. Authorities also learned that Michael lived in Sharpsburg, close to the first pawn shop where the stolen jewelry had been taken. Everything was making sense now. Theodore Hazlitt had been right about the jewelry. He had just been wrong about the person who had brought it in. Of course, this was only half of the story. If Michael LaPaia was involved in Jack's murder, what was his motive? Fortunately, detectives would soon uncover a possible explanation for that as well. Investigators learned that over the past couple of years, Michael's life had been in something of a downward spiral. He had actually been kicked out of the military for synthetic marijuana use, and since then had moved on to much harder stuff. As his drug habits increased, the knock-on effects to his work and personal life only became greater. Detectives discovered that Michael had been fired from a bank job after more than $2,700 had gone missing from his cash drawer in a short amount of time, and he had also started stealing from family members. This had apparently included Jack and Carol. The previous Labor Day, they had thrown a party at their house, after which several pieces of jewelry had gone missing. Michael had been seen in their bedroom during the party, and as a result, hadn't been welcome in their house since. Despite all of this, no one in the family had ever considered for a second that Michael could be responsible for something as terrible as Jack's murder. That's why, when originally asked, Carol hadn't thought to bring up Michael's name during questioning. She and Jack had loved Michael. Growing up, they had treated him like he was their own son. So much so that when detectives called Carol up and shared their suspicions with her that Michael might be the killer, her first response was, "Michael who?" Deciding that they still needed a little more to round out the case, detectives brought in Michael LaPaia and Melanie Gigliotti for more questioning. They were interviewed in separate rooms, with police stopping every so often to compare what was being said. At first, the couple denied everything and said that they knew nothing about Jack's murder. They continued this even after they were confronted about the stolen jewelry and the pawn shop footage, with Melanie claiming that the gold belonged to her and had been given to her by her father. She also claimed that during the time of the murder, Michael had been at a friend's house who she referred to by the name Big Black.
Melanie, we began speaking to you earlier today. We had presented you with a photo of the jewelry that we had recovered. And initially, what did you tell us about that?
It looks similar to jewelry that I have.
Okay.
July 21st. Where was he at?
At his friend Black's house.
Michael also mentioned Big Black, though admitted that he was less of a friend and more of a drug dealer.
Michael, you identify the photograph of being Black, correct?
Yes.
That's one of the people you sometimes purchase narcotics from.
Yes.
Of course, detectives already knew that the information that Michael and Melanie were providing was a lie. They were sure that the gold they recovered from Becky Halverson's pawn shop belonged to Jack and Carol. And they also knew that Michael's cell phone placed him at the crime scene right during the window when Jack had been killed. After going back and forth for some time, Michael seemed to realize this as well, changing his story and saying that he was ready to tell the truth. The 23-year-old explained that ever since his deployment to Afghanistan in 2010, he had been suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. He said that for the last couple of years he had been self-medicating with drugs, especially heroin, but that this had become harder and harder to afford after he found himself unemployed. Despite this, on the morning of July 21st, Michael claimed that he just wanted to see Jack to try and patch things up between them. He stated that he asked Melanie to go with him, and the two of them drove down to the house, arriving there shortly before noon. They parked a little ways down the street. He told Melanie to stay behind, and he headed to the house by himself. Michael explained that when Jack opened the door, things immediately went south. Instead of accepting his apology, he said that his uncle had attacked him. He started choking him, and Michael said he feared for his life. He pulled out his .380 pistol. It went off, and the next thing he knew, Jack was dead.
I was suffering from PTSD. I had 2 nights of no sleep, and the morning of July 21st, I asked Mel to take a ride with me. I knocked on her door to apologize and talk. At that time, he became hostile and swung at me, and he choked me. And at that time, I felt my life was threatened, and I had a pistol, .380 on me, and it went off.
Michael said that afterwards he had panicked, and because he needed money, he started looking through the house. He said that after selling Jack and Carol's stolen gold, he had used the money to buy more heroin. While Michael may have admitted to shooting Jack, detectives knew that this story couldn't possibly be the truth. For starters, it didn't match any of the evidence at the scene. Everything police had found suggested that Jack had been caught off guard by his attacker while walking away. There was certainly no sign of the violent struggle that Michael had described. On top of this, if Michael had been there to make peace, why had he parked down the street where no one could see him? Why had he brought a gun with him? And most importantly, why had he ransacked his aunt and uncle's house? To investigators, the answer was clear. Michael had been there intending to rob Jack from the start, and he knew the only way to get his hands on the valuables was if his uncle was dead. Following his partial confession, Michael was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Melanie, meanwhile, was released as authorities couldn't prove she had any knowledge of the crime or had taken part in it. When the case went to trial the following year, Michael's defense team argued self-defense, but also leaned heavily on his claims of suffering from PTSD. I should point out that a lot of sources mention that he suffered from PTSD, though others seem to call into question whether he actually ever received any kind of formal diagnosis. Regardless, it seems that the jury didn't buy it. In June of 2015, Michael was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life without parole. I don't know about you, but I definitely came away from this story feeling an almost equal mixture of anger and sadness. Anger because I truly cannot wrap my head around how Michael could have repaid all the love that his aunt and uncle gave him over the course of his life with such an unimaginable act of cruelty. And sadness because of the amazing life that Carol and Jack should have had together that was so painfully ripped away from them. I can't even imagine the emotions that Carol herself must have experienced. At Michael's sentencing hearing, she was among those that delivered a victim impact statement, saying in part, quote, "My fiancé, Jack Parks, was murdered by Michael LaPaya on July 21st, 2014, and I want your honor to know how deeply it has impacted my life. Although Michael was not my brother's biological son, Jack and I loved him the same as our own family. Michael's actions have not only affected me personally, but have also devastated his own family. Those lives are forever changed." When Jack Parks was laid to rest, he was buried with his favorite hat, vest, and most symbolically of all, his wedding ring. It appears that Carol still wears her ring to this day, a reminder of the love and commitment that she and Jack had for each other, even if they never got to have the wedding that they deserved. Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.